I would like now to ask a question to Dr. Yaffe in relation to economic sanctions. So could you explain what the economic sanctions on Cuba entail and how they continue to adversely affect Cuba's economy, healthcare system, and everyday life, and what functions do these sanctions serve, both materially and ideologically? And how is Cuba resisting them?
Okay. So, could you let me know when I've spoken for 10 minutes? Because this is such a big topic. The
Sure, I
first
will.
thing to say is that economic warfare that I described in Lester Mallory's memorandum started before the formal embargo, as they call it in the United States. So it started with the cutting off of the United States had a sugar quota that it said to each country with which it had sort of semi-colonial relations, this is how much sugar we'll take from you, and they reduced that and they dropped the remaining amount from the quota, and then they instructed their businesses to not cooperate and so on. And then the Soviet oil arrived at the oil refineries, which were US and British owned, and the US government instructed them not to refine it. So that was economic warfare before formal embargo. So let me deal with this question because I don't call it an embargo, I call it a blockade. And there is a sort of legal and political difference. And you can tell people's position on Cuba partly by whether they use the term embargo or blockade. So, an embargo is the right of any country. The government can say, people can't use our ports to trade with this specific country, and is under their own jurisdiction. A blockade is when your one country's policy actually obstructs trade with the other country, but also with third parties. And the embargo, which I call blockade, of the United States has actually been extraterritorial. That means it affects third countries since practically the beginning. And the way it did that is it said, right, we don't allow trade with Cuba. Fine, that's your embargo. That's its right. But then it said any country that supports Cuba or trades with Cuba will withdraw aid. Right. So these are the kind of mechanisms that the US blockade has used. And it's now got to such an extreme level that the 1st of May executive order by Trump, which this is the second executive order of the year. So the first one was on the 29th of January. The first one declared that Cuba was a threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, which is patently absurd if we're thinking in terms of a military threat. The only way that Cuba can be understood as a threat to the United States is in that sense that I explained before, a threat of a good example, right? Threat of like a public healthcare system delivered on the basis of need, prioritizing human beings rather than rationed through the market, right? So you can only afford medical care if you can pay for it and so on. The second executive order of the 1st of May, and incidentally, the timing is on purpose. On the 1st of May, 5 million Cubans of a population of 10 million around the country went out and celebrated or demonstrated on International Workers' Day, right? 1st of May. And this is despite the fact that there's no fuel for transport. It was a big struggle for people to get to the meeting point in Havana or wherever. But people around the country protested to defend their revolution. And they also signed a petition. Millions of Cubans signed a petition to, defend sovereignty and oppose the US oil siege and the blockade. So the point is the second executive order was followed by a set of sanctions on the 7th of May, which carried the extraterritorial character of the US blockade to its extreme. Any entity or individual in any country, anywhere in the world that engages with Cuba can now be subject to punitive sanctions and punishment from the United States. Now, the US is, the globally leading economy arguably China's, snapping at its heels, but it controls the international financial system. And this, I'm sure, in the case of Iran and the case of the other, I don't know, it's over 50 countries that are sanctioned by the United States. This is the main mechanism for its leverage. It weaponizes its control over the international financial system. So the US dollar is the international currency. The Washington Post explained that I think in 2019, 89, nearly 90% of international trade was carried out in the dollar, right? So it's an international currency, but at the same time, the United States can decide, because it's a US, they control its the production of dollars, the printing of dollars, they can decide who can and can't hold the dollar, transact with the dollar, right? So that's the way they implement sanctions. And for example, I'll give you, I just wanted to make actually a broader point about what we call the blockade. It is not one piece of legislation. The blockade is a set of laws that have been incremented over the years. So it's something like 6 main statutes of legislation. Some things are overlapping and contradictory and all the rest of it. But in 1996, a new set of laws was introduced called the Helms-Burton Act. And one of the measures of that was that the US embargo blockade was embedded in the US Constitution. So it was no longer in the capacity of a president to sign, previously to that, they could sign a declaration just to remove those sanctions. And that's why, Obama, in his final 2 years, when he was desperate to have some sort of legacy, and he entered rapprochement with Cuba, and he said, I think the embargo should be lifted, but he couldn't do it because he would have required a vote in Congress, and he didn't believe that he would get that, so he didn't take it to Congress. So that's the first thing. It's a very complex web of different financial instruments, of trade instruments, of basically brute force. But in addition to that, there's the sort of coercive measures. So I'll give you an example. During COVID, when Cuba's sending brigades to help combat, it's sending its disease specialists, its epidemiological specialists to countries all over the world. And the United States is picking up the phone and saying to the state, you might want to think about doing that because you've got a lot of trade with us that could be impacted if you bring Cuban doctors in to save lives, right? Those are the kind of coercive measures. So, to explain, I like to explain it in this way because it seems so abstract. How does it work, the blockade, right? As I said, I'm in Britain, I'm a British citizen, I have a British bank account. Now, UK law, British law, since 1980 has had legislation that says it's illegal for the US to impose its embargo on us. We're not subject to US jurisdiction. And the the British law has protected the right of British citizens and entities to trade with Cuba. It doesn't take the same hostile attitude. It also doesn't oppose the US, right? So this law was increased after that Helms-Burton Act. Britain passed more legislation saying it's illegal to apply the Helms-Burton Act against British citizens and entities. The European Union did the same. Canada did the same. Brazil did the same. The United Nations encouraged countries around the world to have legislation to protect their citizens so they could continue to trade with Cuba or exchange with Cuba. Cuba does a lot of scientific exchanges. There's the medical programs, art, culture, and all sorts of stuff. However, they don't enforce the law. And what that means is that the US can simply say, Cuba's on our sanctioned list, and if any entity, whether it's a corporation or a financial institution, engages with Cuba, we'll just sanction you. And because the British government or the EU government won't take a legal action and won't implement its own legislation to block that, the US blockade is a global blockade against Cuba. And it's absolutely suffocating. As I said, British citizen with a British bank account, if I send £1 sterling to someone in Europe, right, to convert it into euros, and I put the word Cuba anywhere in that transaction, in the reference or the address, yeah, that transaction will be blocked, even though it hasn't been converted into US dollars and it hasn't been sent to Cuba. So now, if you see how that affects me, and it affects me personally, because I've tried to engage with academics on projects in Cuba, and my university says, oh no, our bank won't allow that. Right. So it's effect is in every single sector. And now you imagine being the Cuban government, which is a small island nation. So it's dependent on trade, whether Cuba's capitalist or socialist, it's always going to be dependent on trade because it doesn't have all the natural resources it needs. Plus, it engages with the world through its, incredible, innovative science and technology, its culture and art and so on. So can you imagine, even when the Cubans have sent medical services overseas, the payments they should receive are blocked, for example, by Commerce Bank, which did a transaction when Cubans sent maternity services to Algeria. Yeah. So this is repeated every single day in every single sector. I have studied Cuban development in different sectors. I've looked at sustainable development and climate change adaptation. I've looked at biotechnology. I've looked at all different sectors, and everywhere you look, and you interview people, they can tell you how the US blockade has impeded their ability to import the best and latest technology, to exchange with people, to establish partnerships. And it's absolutely, it does make a difference on life. And I just want to say about on this question of the impact on human beings, right? Because this is not a technical issue. So for many years, people would ask me, like I'd have journalists saying, like, what evidence is there that the US blockade kills people in Cuba? And the answer was very little, because as the Cuban government is a socialist state, it's been impacted, its development, its wealth, its technology, as I said, infrastructure, but it has channeled its resources towards the vulnerable. That's the way that Cuban policy, even now when they're, introducing economic reforms, the point is to say, if we have no wealth in this country, we cannot direct them towards protection of those in need, right? So the point is that for many years it was not very clear to be able to say this is the blockade and these are those who die. If you compare that to, for example, the blockade, the sanctions against Iraq, yeah, that were killing, UNICEF said, 150 children every day in the 1990s. And that was charted. Now, what happened is when the second Trump administration came in, 2017, and then they started to augment, to increase and intensify sanctions on Cuba to pursue what they openly called maximum pressure strategy. And then you started to see, as this dovetailed with COVID, yeah, people dying as a direct response of the US sanctions. So Cuba, wonderful science. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, innovative science. I don't want to talk too long about it, but they've led the world in lung cancer immunotherapy. They now have a Alzheimer's drug, which is extremely promising. It's improving cognitive ability, not just slowing down decline. They were the first in the world with a meningitis B vaccine, the first to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, the first with a human synthetic antigen. It's quite extraordinary for a small, colonized, blockaded, previously colonized, 400 years of colonialism and imperialism, and then blockaded, and they've achieved all this, right, just by prioritizing, science and technology, not for private profit, but for social development. And yet, so they were the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to develop COVID-19 vaccines. Probably some of you know that. And yet they couldn't get the syringes needed to vaccinate their population. Why? Because if you remember, US companies were going around the world buying up all of the manufacturers of PPE and syringes and so on. And they couldn't get the syringes because the manufacturers, even if they're German and they're bought out by a subsidiary of the US, they cannot sell to Cuba. And Cuba had a
Sorry to interrupt. 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Go on.
Cuba had, a surge of COVID. Its hospitals were overrun for the first time. They've never seen their public healthcare service system overwhelmed. Then their only medical oxygen plant broke down. And they asked the US, please allow us to buy replacement parts so that we can provide oxygen for our patients who are dying. And the US refused. And now, I mean, now, if you look at infant mortality in Cuba, as I said, those are one of the indicators which give me the ability to say that Cuba was similar to Haiti before the Cuban Revolution. The infant mortality rate has plummeted. It's come right down. It's extraordinary. And infant mortality is a really key indicator because it reflects the mother's health and diet, care of, that they don't have to work while they're heavily pregnant. They have these homes for pregnant women if they need it, and it reflects infrastructure of public health and so on. Their infant mortality came down to below 4 per thousand, which is extraordinary, right? It's comparative with the best countries in the world. It's better than the United States. But not only that, the 4 per thousand was the shared nationally, right? So there's not that difference that you see. Like the US has 7 point something, but the difference between rural and urban areas is huge, right? So, or poor black communities or immigrant communities in the US have much higher infant mortality than the wealthy white communities. So in Cuba, it's actually sometimes better in rural areas. And what's happened to their infant mortality? It's almost doubled in the last few years since the United States has pursued a maximum pressure policy. And so 1,000 babies have died as a direct consequence of this US blockade under Trump since 2019. And now there are over 100,000 people who are on lists for surgery, but they can't get them because there's no oil. The Cuban hospitals have had to close to all but emergency treatment. The schools, the universities, people can't, even if the hospitals are open, people can't get the transport to get them to the hospitals. So, these are the effects of sanctions. They are international. They affect everyone. They violate the rights of all of us, and they violate the human rights of Cubans. They are killing Cubans, and they are the biggest obstacle to development in Cuba. And to have that scenario and at the same time listening to Marco Rubio deny that there's a blockade and blame all of Cuba's problems and inefficiencies on the Cuban government is just an insult. And, I think it's really important that this is why I focus my work on showing what Cubans have been able to achieve under this blockade. And you just left to think, what on earth would they be able to achieve if they weren't just struggling to survive and if they were actually given the space to breathe and to prosper?